I heard about Henry Kissinger. I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard that Henry Kissinger would, before going to diplomatic meetings, would eat a stick of butter because at these dinners, like everyone's drinking and stuff, right? And then there's some like negotiation that happened after dinner. And you don't want to not drink because then they like have that same sort of social vibe. But by eating the stick of butter, it made him become less drunk and therefore have the upper hand in negotiation.
Does butter do that?
I don't even know if this is a true story. I like feel like I heard this one
Where
time
do
in
you
college.
find these stories? I feel like you've always got these insane stories. How many calories are in a stick of butter?
I Googled it, I didn't find anything, so maybe it's not true.
Wow. There's only 810 calories in a stick of butter. I honestly would have, dude, I would have guessed 3,000 calories minimum. Add a zero to that. It's nothing. How much butter is 2,000 calories? People really want to know how much butter they can consume in one day. Now, this one says it's 3 tablespoons. Don't know if I believe this. Whipped butter is even lighter calories because lightweight.
Let's start with utility. I don't understand what it even means.
Everybody has some kind of utils in their head that they're calibrating.
There's hardly anything that hasn't been used for money.
In fact, there may be a fundamental problem in modeling what I want to model.
Game Economist Cast, episode 29. We're back. We're back on a regular schedule-ish. It's summer. Everyone in Europe is on vacation. Hi, I'm Phil Black from Game Economist Consulting. I am joined by my two other wonderful co-hosts today. Chris from Star Atlas. Chris, how are you?
Doing well. It's the summer of data review, data maintenance, and data analysis. We are in a holding pattern in terms of new feature releases. Just get to finally kick back and do all the stuff that I've been putting off for months.
And, of course, Eric from not Super Layer anymore.
Yeah, I'm at a second dinner now.
Still having a good time?
Yeah, we had the last week off, the July 4th week off.
Whoa.
Yeah, if your employer didn't give you that week off, that means they don't love America as much as second dinner does. You should make sure they know that. Yeah, it's been pretty good. It's been hot, but otherwise no complaints.
We have an exciting episode planned, as always. Not only are we covering a piece I wrote on Squad Busters, because I can't help myself playing too much Squad Busters, we are introducing a new segment to the Game Economist Cast, which may prove divisive for our audience, but we are going to be reviewing a paper, an economics paper that may have been published recently or may have been published a long time ago. We're talking about just doing Nobel Prize winning papers, although we won't be doing that this week. We'll be looking at a really interesting paper called One Cohort at a Time and New Perspective on the Declining Gender Pay Gap. Sometimes there will be a games tie-in. Sometimes there will not be a games tie-in. But I think one of the things that we found is that a lot of the really cool research and thinking that happens in academia doesn't really make it outside the walls of the Ivy, so to speak. And we want to be connected to our roots, our home base. And a lot of that happens in like very traditional economic research. And so this is an opportunity to expose some of that research and some of that beautiful thinking to people who may be in games and also people who may not be in games. And so we're going to start that off today. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Also, we're finally in video. I fucked it up last time. You may have noticed I said we're going to be in sparkling 4K and then it never happened. Although you can have the high definition audio, but we have video. We're going to be on YouTube. So we're going to be sharing charts, graphs. People are going to have to look at us. It's not going to be good. You're going to find out what we look like and going to be immediately disappointed. We coordinated our t-shirts today, Chris and I. Eric, you get the message.
What?
Oh man, it's a plain monochrome t-shirt.
Yeah.
Before we talk about Squad Busters and that paper, let's talk about what we've been playing.
Got a selection of good things on sale, stranger.
Eric, what have you been playing?
I have been playing Inkbound a little bit. It's a roguelike.
Surprise. Shit. Is there a drinking game for Game Economist Cast yet? That's going in my middle space.
The special thing about this one is it's built for live service co-op, which, as we talked about in the past, roguelikes are popular, but they tend to be single player. They tend not to have live service. Don't get too excited, Phil. There's no monetization on the live service, but it is built to have like leaderboards and seasons. And most interestingly, I think the co-op, it's a tactic game, like a turn-based tactic game that managed to make co-op pretty good. If you've ever tried to play co-op tactics games, they tend to be extremely slow. Played Baldur's Gate 3 with your friends. It takes 30 minutes to do one fight.
This is just SKU. This is just like cost $15 or something on Steam.
Yeah, flat price. I bought it Steam sale. I think it'd be cool to see more Like I said, live service roguelikes. Oh, I don't have to rehash that whole spiel.
What spiel?
Chris, we were talking about Lapso. No one's really figured out monetization for this.
Yeah, roguelikes seem like they would fit perfectly in a live service model. Play it over and over. You make minor tweaks, these progression resets, and just them very well. But at the same time, no one's fit them into the live service monetization model, which has proven very successful for other games, right? Why is that? Why has no one cracked the nut here? One theory was always multiplayer, that live service works only for multiplayer games because you need that social component. You need that if you're going to sell cosmetics or sell power, you need someone to peacock your power to. And if you can make a social co-op like roguelike, maybe that nail on the head.
Does Squad Busters count as a roguelike?
We're going to be talking about that. I actually think there's an interesting case for this. It incorporates a lot of roguelike elements. And Eric, I think we were talking about this last episode or offline. You could put CCGs as a roguelike in some sense, right? It is true that you're making a deck beforehand, but you're drawing random cards, right? And you're still doing a lot of that theory crafting on the fly. Squad Busters operates in basically the same way in that you still have to unlock characters, but the characters that you choose to bring into a match randomly select for you. So it's almost like the deck is being selected for you. That to me is a really interesting model. I haven't seen a lot of roguelikes implement. The reality of moving to a roguelike that has monetization is that you need some level of permanence. So you have to lock some roguelike abilities behind something that you have to monetize. You have to collect them at some level. I think you just have to sacrifice that as a roguelike game to get this thing off the ground, which kind of, it does harm a little bit of the theory crafting, since the theory crafting is only as large as your collection of abilities or things that ultimately can interact to create some sort of interesting machine. If we were talking about like that game, if you had to earn out of round a lot of the abilities that would show up randomly, the design space or your ability to create those really cool, Goldberg machines, like your ability to craft the design space would shrink so much until you acquired so many items. I think it just radically transforms the game into something that isn't really palatable. But I still think if a designer started with the precept that you're going to have to collect some of these roguelike abilities, I think they could craft a better experience to incorporate the monetization element in without killing your ability to build that machine early on.
That's true. Most roguelikes, you start with a subset of the available relics or power-ups, and you unlock the more complex ones as you play more.
Do you get out-of-round progression in Slay the Spire? I don't think so, right? It's just in-round.
Yeah, you get more cards and relics that get added to the
You get
random
access
pool.
to okay.
Yeah.
Because I was going to say,
and the ones you unlock are generally stronger, but it's not very dramatic.
Because I found Vampire Survivors overwhelming. I enjoyed the in-round progression. The out-of-round progression was just like, with all the characters, the unlocks, like all the different quests. I'm curious, because you've got Balatro, which is actually the game I've been playing recently. You've got Balatro where there's no out-of-round progression from what I have been able to glean. I think
you get decks. You can get the different deck format, the different card backs, which have different abilities. So that's the one thing they have.
Okay, that's it.
A deck would say you don't collect interest, you get 10 more currency per win. But that's it. It's just that one ability.
I'm just curious what's the marginal, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. What's the marginal additional hours played or the marginal retention for out-of-round progression versus in-round progression? You could imagine a game that's 0 in-round progression, all out-of-round, and then vice versa. Something that's more, I guess, not Balatro, but Balatro or Slay the Spire, where a lot of it is in-round, and then versus something like Vampire Spires is where it's mostly out-of-round progression. At least that's the majority of the actual progress you're going to make. And I'm just curious if there's a trade-off, or
how would you set up that RCT?
I think it's pretty. You could imagine it's pretty simple to do practically, like it's very easy to set up the theory, but it would be difficult to actually implement. Like it'd be costly. You could basically just like Vampire Survivors, take out the out-of-round progression, which is still a fun game. Vampire Survivors with the in-round progression, random cohorts.
Because in Vampire Survivors, the only out-of-round is that you get new characters, right? And the new characters have a default roguelike ability attached to them.
So you get new characters, you get new weapons, you get currency that allows you to purchase perks, and you level up your characters. So there's both, you can go wide and you can go deep. So there's vertical and horizontal progression out of round. Yeah. You could imagine a more subtle one where maybe there's one additional mechanic, out of round mechanic, and there's versus you add in a single additional out of round mechanic. The problem is I think this would be a really long-term study, and that would be extremely costly. This isn't, let's run this experiment for 48 hours and have one yellow button and one purple button and see which one gets clicked more. This is like probably just too large. You would have to probably do more of a meta-analysis than an actual experiment, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's like core to the design of the game, right? It's not like a simple knob you tweak.
Yes, I see what you're saying. I don't think that's necessarily true. Like, for me, out of round progression, as long as you can get better at the game and you can like actually accomplish beating a level, like I think Vampire Survivors is a great example of this because the out of round progression really just makes you ridiculously powerful. Like you can beat a level with a completely unleveled you could never touch the out of round progression and still beat each of the levels in Vampire Survivors versus something like maybe Slay the Spire is actually a good example. There are some combos that if you don't have those combos, you will not be able to beat some of the cities, or I'm not able to beat the cities without certain combos. I don't know.
I guess another way of thinking about it is like how many tries does a player need to take to beat a level, right? And one way games traditionally help people is if you fail repeatedly, your like stats go up. You level up, you get better gear, you get better whatever, and it makes it easier to beat it. Another way roguelikes handle this is just the randomness. You might just get lucky rolls. You might just get a certain set of relics that happen to be really powerful. You might have the experience in Balatro where you beat a difficult level just by playing it over and over until you get a lucky draw.
I've been playing Balatro. That's the game I've been playing. And
Tell us about it.
so far it's interesting. I got it on sale from Steam for $13.
Did they put it on sale too early? That's a question I have.
It's $2. I would have bought it either way. I didn't know it was on sale. I didn't really care that it was on sale. So maybe you're right. Maybe they didn't need to do that, but
There's been a shift away from that, interestingly enough, Eric, to your point. People used to discount pretty heavily pretty early on, and they've actually moved away from that. If you go to steamdb.com, you can see the price history for a lot of games. If you look at some of the recent paid releases, the discounts are not as deep and they're not as frequent anymore. But the research I always heard from Valve, and we do know someone who works at Valve, is that the discounting was always effective at Steam. Like the usual economist response to discounting is, well, maybe, but if you continue to discount, you have predictable discounts, then people will withhold their purchasing behavior until there's a discount and then only purchase when there's a discount. But it turns out like so many customers are time insensitive that the revenue maximizing strategy it essentially just becomes price discrimination of, okay, when you release this full price, you're going to get everyone at the full price. And then when you discount, you're only targeting a very specific set of customers that wouldn't have purchased otherwise. And so like the revenue maximizing strategy is to do these discounts over the long run, although it feels like there's been a shift in how you get the song, how you get the rhythm. But again, I would just really love for Valve to publish anything on this. Like anyone to publish anything on this would be really nice. Okay.
I was going to say something else, but I can't remember what it was. Oh, it has to do with discounting. This is just a pet peeve, and I'm just going to use this. This is an opportunity to bitch. I was trying to buy the Elden Ring DLC, the Shadow of the Erd Tree, and I tried to take pictures of my experience, but I have an iPhone 7 and it doesn't take pictures anymore. So, like, you go to the main page, the main Xbox store, Shadow of the Erd Tree, you click on it, you're like, oh, that's cool, I'm going to go buy that. And it says, here are the 3 versions you have available to purchase. One is $50, one is $60, and one is $80 or something, the different versions. And I had heard that the DLC was $40. And I was like, that's weird. I don't see the $40 version. I just see $50. I had to do some Googling to figure out how to get to the $40 version of the game. You have to scroll all the way down, go to the different pieces that are in the package, and you have to specifically click on, and it's not obvious that this is something you can click on, but you have to specifically click on Shadow of the Erd Tree DLC, and then there's also fucking like song or something that comes with it. That's the $10 extra. So I like clicked on that. I finally found the $39.99 SKU. And I was so pissed off. And I really would love to know what's the delta like. What are the proportion of people who just they just buy it for $50 because they don't know that the $40 SKU exists.
It's like Phil was saying, time insensitive. There's also just like UX pain in the ass insensitive.
Ignorant. Yeah. I mean,
the big things I used to always preach with a lot of the devs is that you want to have your DLC as a single purchase item on the Steam page, right? Because you want everything at the point of sale. You want to maximize revenue at the point of sale. You don't want things split out into those drop-down menus on Steam. Like sometimes you have to say show more and you can buy the bundles. You want everything as easy as possible and you want to be able to buy it with the main SKU too. Because like people, I think sometimes the heuristic is I want the best. I want the best. And because games generate so much overwhelming value for customers relative to their price, that like the difference between $40 and $70 is relatively minor. Like they're not very, a lot of these games aren't very inelastic for those time insensitive customers. Literally just put the money, this price of special editions have been creeping up. Like when people talk about the price of games not moving in the last 20, 25 years, when you adjust for inflation, and sometimes even declining, they're forgetting that like we have increased price. We've just done it through special editions.
Yeah, that's fair. My question for you guys, is this good or bad use of monetization? And I think it's bad. I think it's hiding information, and I think that it's bad for the consumer. We had the big, is our bots good or bad for the consumers discussion. I'm curious your thoughts on this. If you can make it ambiguous what the true price is, and then basically it's almost like an experiment. It's almost like an econ experiment. You have a true value of a product that the player doesn't know, and then you give them a slew of options, and they have to evaluate the value of the product based on what they know about it, which might be a limited set of information, and choose the correct price. I had that $50, $60, $80 SKU option. I didn't even have the $40 option, but to me, it's a bad thing. And I think if you were to run an experiment, people would almost always click the cheapest available option, assuming they get the product.
It's a similar question to is free-to-play games good, right? It is allowing the firm to price discriminate more effectively better for social welfare.
What are they hiding, Chris? I guess I don't understand what's being hid in those different SKU options. Different SKUs, they're different value propositions. That seems fine.
He knew what he wanted. He wanted the base DLC and nothing else at the lowest price.
And the only reason I didn't purchase the 50 is because someone told me it was supposed to cost 40. And that was a human being who told me that. I never saw an advertisement for go buy Elden Ring DLC, $40. I never saw that. I just knew that the Elden Ring DLC was coming out, and it was basically like Elden Ring 2. So $50 price tag would make sense. The only reason I didn't purchase it is because I knew it was supposed to be 40. So to me, it was...
What was in the $50 SKU that wasn't in the $40 SKU?
I think it was some sort of like a soundtrack.
Okay. So they're trying to create a special edition of the DLC to push the average transaction size higher, and the one you actually wanted. So they used a bundling strategy to push average transaction price higher, and they made information to acquire the $40 base SKU more expensive to acquire. Is that ethically wrong? Is that the right way to think about it? Right way to frame the question?
I think that's a pretty good way to put it. I think it's wrong. Because here's the cherry on top for me. When I clicked on the big Elden Ring DLC banner, only 3 SKUs showed up, and none of those SKUs were the $40 version. Each one was a different type of bundle. There was this, when you give me options, I assume that those are all the options. When you give me 3 different versions of a type of product I can buy, those are probably, if I go to the Apple website to buy an iPhone, I have a choice of color and a choice of the storage capacity. I don't expect that there are other options that aren't secretly behind the scenes that I need to search for. You know what I mean? So to me, that's really, I definitely agree with your statement. They made it more expensive for me to discover the different SKUs. But to me, the way they did it was like not economic, was manipulative.
I guess see, this feels like choice architecture for me. I would go back to what I would argue is like good ethical principles that every game economist should subscribe to. Don't lie, don't cheat, and don't steal. And it's not the case that those are easy to apply everywhere. They're simple rules, but it gets complicated and there's murky water. And what I would argue here is I think it becomes a lie if they're going out and they're advertising that $40 price and they're making it very expensive for you to find out how to actually acquire that $40 price. Like that to me starts to become a borderline lie. Like that to me feels like manipulation if it's very costly to acquire. It's a tough argument to make because it's at the margin, and the philosophers would beat us over the head with a bludgeon because hey, usually they don't think at the margin, and hey, does something become unethical or ethical just based on a marginal analysis of hey, it's okay if they had moved it above the fold or they put it in this place, does it suddenly become ethical? But I would argue it only becomes unethical if they were swinging hard at the price being $40 and they were advertising it. I don't think that was the case. I rarely see price in a really bold format for a DLC package.
Certainly not. Anyway, I think it's a really interesting discussion. To me, you take that classic, like what's the choice architecture book? They like talk about prospect
Cass Sunstein
theory.
and Thaler.
Nudge.
Nudge.
Nudge. The nudge framework is put the product that you think that the person should have as the default option. You walk into a grocery store and the Cheerios are at eye level and the off-brand is at the bottom. Now, in my opinion, Xbox didn't even put the original, the base SKU on the shelf. It was in the back and I had to go ask the manager to take it out for me. That's my problem.
I agree with you. To me, something that would be clearly unethical is like advertising something at a heavily discounted price, but having a very limited quantity of it in stock. Like you only have one in stock. But of course, like it comes back to the margin. Okay, what if you only have 100 in stock? What if there's 200 in stock? Like it become like a lot of this has to go back to intent, right? Which is such a fuzzy concept. It has to go back to intent. What was the intent?
There's infinity in stock, right? Zero marginal cost product here.
True, but in the case of the example I was talking about where like you have a lower price and you only have one in stock, okay, does this... I think that's where a lot of the marginal analysis becomes tough.
Yeah.
Chris, what have you been playing? Elden Ring?
I told you
Balatro.
I was playing Balatro, but I also fell victim to the transmedia thesis. And after finishing Fallout, the TV show on, I think it was on Amazon Prime, I enjoyed that a lot and started playing Fallout 4 and I've been enjoying it. It's free on Xbox Game Pass, so it's a no-brainer. There's a lot of old school games. I think I'm going to get into the Gears series next. I used to play that when I was a kid. Love Gears of War.
Nah, don't do that for yourself.
No, why?
It's never been good since Epic passed it off to the Coalition.
Oh, like Gears 5? I wasn't going to play Gears 5. I'll probably play like Gears 2.
Yeah, there we go.
OG.
Now you're cooking.
But yeah, no, I fell victim to the transmedia thing, and I was like, I'm going to go play this. And I've tried playing Fallout before, and I didn't really enjoy it. So we'll see. This is the beauty of Xbox Game Pass. I can churn, have no more than a 3-day retention, and go on and download Gears 3 or 2. I've chatted with some friends, and they're like, yeah, it's still worth it for me. And I asked them, I was like, at what point is it not worth it anymore? Because Xbox is going to find that. They're going to find it. They're going to find that price point. If they have any decent data scientists or game economists on their staff, they're going to go and try and find the optimal price.
It's so tempting once you're a subscription-based business, to basically look at your MAU, realize that your MAU is not really growing, and just say, if I raise price by $1, it's MAU times price increase. Oh, that's a lot of money. Okay, what if we multiply it by $2? What about $3? Yeah. Okay, what's the result in churn? And it's really hard to argue the result in churn is going to be bigger than the increase in price. The only problem is like new customers facing that higher price that you struggle with. So you got to figure out how you're going to discount you're going to get people into it.
Yeah, and the churn effect's often delayed as well, so you can't really measure it immediately.
Until your subscription renews. That's the only time when it really hits. This has been Netflix's playbook.
Aren't they mostly monthly anyway, though? Nowadays? Netflix is monthly for sure, I think.
It's more that when do you notice? Let's say Xbox increases the price by $2. When are you going to notice?
That's true. That is true. Don't you think? Yeah, geez, this is just the ethics podcast now. Don't you think you should get a fucking notification like to your bank account? Hey, Chris, I actually do get notifications. If a subscription increases, Chase will message me and be like, hey, like you used to get charged $16. Now you're getting charged $20.
Yep. The market has stepped in to try and solve these problems. Like there are now checks and balances against this, which I think has been fantastic to see. There's, I guess if we call that the nudge strategy, there's now a nudge counterattack. And it makes sense, right? You should not be spending resources on thinking about that. It's far more cost efficient for someone else to tell you that this is happening rather than for you to monitor it. Monitoring costs are way too high.
Oh, I totally agree. Yeah. That's counter free market, though. It's not the consumer's job to figure out what they're paying.
Worst experience I had with this with fucking Coinbase. Coinbase signed me up for a $30 a month subscription.
Yep.
For a product I never paid for. I never asked for this thing. Literally made 0 trades with it. Found out a year and a half later. I was fucking livid.
Oh my God.
Yeah, fuck Coinbase. I'm on that team too. I really fucking hate Coinbase.
I get like a notification every fucking month that I have USDC rewards. And I'm like, fuck, I have to like, I'm going to get a tax document for this bullshit because I have $1 in your fucking bank account and you're giving me 5% savings. Yeah. It's annoying.
Phil, what have you been playing these days?
I am back on the Apex Legends train. And I've also been dabbling in a little bit of Overwatch as well. My fascination with Apex goes way back. I worked on the game a little bit. And the thing that blows my mind is their inability to spread, to basically grow beyond Battle Royale. So this to me has been like a really clever strategy that Call of Duty engineered, which is basically taking game and turning it into a platform. using it as an opportunity to launch a bunch of different modes and grow the game and really think of it as an acquisition platform. Because we know like acquisition is one of the most costly things right now in gaming. And so how can you take the mass amount of players playing a given franchise and kind of grow it and expand the hours and the audience? And so Warzone was one of the most successful examples of this. So they took base Call of Duty. Remember, they added in zombies, which is a co-op mode, which is coming back, although that one didn't seem to work to the same heights. But then they added in the Battle Royale mode. They also added in an extraction mode. So they're starting to bolt in all of these modes in a Call of Duty and kind of see what works. What can we point our user base to and see if it's successful? And Apex, which I think was one of the first ones to do this, they added this was a couple of years ago, they added a Counter-Strike-ish mode where you had in-round progression, although the in-round progression was pretty weak. And it never really did that well, and they've added Team Deathmatch as well. So they're trying to add these different modes, but they're just not capturing a significant share of users. And I still think it's the right strategy, still think it's the right thing to do. The problem is that a lot of game teams are afraid to kill things. And it sounds really tempting because once it's already created, it feels like it's zero marginal cost, and it's a sunk cost as well. But what happens is very similar to politics, that you create this cottage industry within your firm when you launch these modes of people who are vested interests in this thing continuing to survive. Because usually there's a lead designer that's appointed to a given mode, when in fact, if it's not working, you either need to pivot pretty quickly or you need to kill it. Because if you continue to let this thing run at only 5% of DAU engaging with it, it becomes a drain on resources, it becomes a drain on the engine. There's just a lot of these hidden taxes, which I think sometimes large corporations have a hard time seeing, but they can really slow down development. But I still think the strategy of taking these given games and using them as platforms to launch other games is super interesting. The thing I was talking to a colleague about was that like mods are pretty much dead. Valve's entire portfolio came from mods. CSGO, Dota, Team Fortress 2, like almost all of their games came from mods. Even their failed games, the auto chess game, was originally a Dota 2 mod. I don't know if Artifact was one, which explains a lot. But all mods have essentially died. What games are being spawned by mods anymore? There's none of them.
Fortnite, PUBG.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it was an Arma mod that
Awesome.
then it was
That's
an H1Z1 mod, and then it was PUBG.
But that's almost been 10 years.
What was
True.
Fortnite a mod of? Or are you just saying there are
Fortnite
mods coming
copied
off
PUBG,
of Fortnite?
yeah.
Oh, okay.
That was also using it as a platform, right? Because that started as a base building defender game
Yeah.
that pivoted into Battle Royale. But I think Roblox has really killed it. Roblox and to a much lesser degree Fortnite creative, but I'm just surprised we haven't seen more games come out of mods. It feels like there's less of it today than there was 10, 20 years ago, and it feels the mood is that shouldn't be the case. It should be the exact opposite. I'm just surprised by that, and I don't think we have a good explanation for that yet.
I've thought a lot about this because I worked on TFT, which did come out of a mod, but you're right. It's much rarer now. I think it's just game development tools are way better now. So a lot of the people who would work on a mod just make an indie game, right?
I really like this explanation, Eric. But you would think they would use it to acquire an audience, right? Because if it's a mod, you already have a built-in user base, right?
That's true, but you also capture very little of the upside.
Yeah, that's also true. Because it's all free.
But on the flip side, I think a lot of people are making the same observation you are, and they're like, maybe we just need to make the platform for it. That's Fortnite Creator and Roblox and all that.
And there is a company called mod.io, which is trying to be a third-party service which attaches onto a game that you can plug in and create a modding ecosystem very quickly. Because one of the challenges with a lot of these mods is that it's a pain in the ass to actually put them in a game because they're usually not explicitly developer supported. If you go in and try to build try to integrate in a Witcher mod. So after I watched the Witcher TV series, okay, I'm going to get into the Witcher game series. And what was the first thing I wanted? I wanted Henry Cavill's face, as the Witcher. And it was like just a lot of hoopla to get this thing in. And I ended up churning from that experience. Like anytime you make me go into my C drive and I'm in program files, I'm peacing out. I don't fuck that either.
I have an alternative theory. The labor force of people who were doing mods is now just basically integrated with the actual companies themselves. There was this fringe, and they're now just assimilated into the actual companies themselves. And what used to be a mod is now just like a feature update.
So basically the game industry has grown so much that they basically just absorb people. There was an outstrip of supply relative to demand.
Yep.
And now demand has caught up to supply. And
Exactly. I liked your post on somebody's LinkedIn, your comments on somebody's LinkedIn post, just like the share of the count of employees in the games industry over the last 20 years. I think that's just going to be that needs to be like the blanket response for flooding the industry oh, they're cutting our jobs, they're killing us. Yeah, but we've also seen 100% growth in the last 10 years.
I'm curious about this theory, Chris. So this implies that it's those skilled game developers who in the past were just making mods. They're much easier for the companies to find and hire them, and maybe the companies have bigger budgets to hire them. So what would be the mechanism behind this? Yeah, what has changed in the market that has gotten them hired for modding?
The mechanism that's gotten them hired, I think it's just that the industry has grown. They have more money, they have more disposable income, and they can hire more people. And who are the people who are qualified? The people who are already building mods. It's really more of a selection story than a mechanism.
But you're saying there was like a fixed number of people interested in developing games, but the number of companies has been growing.
Assume that the labor demand is X in time period 0, and the supply is Y, or is X plus 2 in time period 0. And then at time period 1, you don't even need, so the supply is up here. You don't even need growth in the supply, the labor supply, but you ended up with growth in the labor demand. You're just naturally going to increase the labor force. And so that share of non-market participants decreases because more people are actually working for the game companies.
Great anecdotal evidence exactly to that point, Chris, is that Frogmind, I may have that name wrong, is the guy who was behind some of the Dota stuff, behind Dota 2, got hired by Valve. IceFrog, thank you. He got hired by Valve and is now working on Deadlock, by the way, which is Valve's third-person shooter, which I just got a playtest access to. Full review incoming soon. But that's really great anecdotal evidence to support your point.
We'll take it. We'll take n equal 1. And
speaking of labor markets,
yeah. All right, let's talk about Squad Buff. I spent way too much time on the deconstruction of it. I made a lot of claims that ended up being not well received when the game actually launched. One of the claims I made is that this game would have historic download volume. And I made that claim because Squad Busters from Supercell combines the IP of all Supercell games into one. And just one side note here, I haven't seen anyone make like the post late stage capitalism point that basically all franchises are moving towards this multiverse future, which could not be more like late stage capitalism. So if you think about like MCU is moving towards these merged universes, like we have got Deadpool and Wolverine coming out pretty soon. And of course, you have the different universes that's always been colliding for that. You had Spider-Man No Way Home that did this. I had another great example of this happening.
Fortnite just puts every IP in there.
Fortnite puts every IP, and it has the same portal mechanic, right? Of all these worlds colliding. There actually is a narrative to Fortnite that tries to string this together. It's not right. Magic the Gathering is doing this. It has Warhammer 40k is now showing up. Kaiju cards, or excuse me, kaijus are now showing up in the game. Overwatch is now doing a Transformers bundle. Like everyone is just like saying fuck it to their IP and saying let's put all the toys together and see what happens. And Squad Busters is in many ways a perfect example of this because it's not just a stunt. The whole IP is supposed to be a reflection of all of Supercell's IP. And I thought Supercell was really building brand equity. Really thought they were building brand recognition. One of the things that Rob Lowe, who's a marketing executive at Supercell, mentioned in an interview is that the Barbarian from Clash of Clans is one of the few recognizable characters from mobile IP. And when you think about kind of Western mobile IP, it's not in a good place. Like it's been very hard for mobile to build IP. Like when you think about, okay, what is the mobile IP that's been really successful? We got Rovio. Angry Birds was successful like maybe 10 years ago. But the best that could do in terms of branching out beyond mobile was like a mediocre film series. And then the only other one I could really come to mind is a failed Mario Lopez Candy Crush TV show that'll never let King live down. You guys really missed this if you haven't seen clips from this. Mario Lopez, it's a game show. And you're like, how would you do a Candy Crush game show? And if you're curious about that question,
it has no IP. I don't understand. Like, there's a fucking bean, like a jelly bean.
I know. It's hilarious. It's like Japanese game show style. Like, they have the board and they're like crawling on the board trying to match gems. Boy, it's embarrassing. And there's been like a little bit of Subway Surfer stuff. If you're familiar with that franchise, they're like kind of trying to do an animated series. But relative to the amount of revenue and amount of downloads and active users that all of these IPs have generated, like, this is the best we can do. It's embarrassing. But I did think Supercell is different than that. And what I expected is a lot of that IP to drive so many downloads. And it turns out, so I want to do analysis and figure out, hey, what's going on? Why isn't this working? I ended up developing an art package for this, which should be out soon. I won't be in the show notes, but maybe next week. So what we're looking at right now is we're looking at Squad Busters download collapse. And what we're doing is we're benchmarking it against the other 3 Supercell titles, which are relevant enough in terms of download. So if you think about Heyday and Clash of Clans, those are not included here because they had very weird launches almost a decade ago. I think in 2013, they actually had staggered launches on iOS and Android a year apart. So I chose not to include this in this analysis because too much noise and isn't really relevant. So Squad Busters started with a huge number of downloads, 8 million downloads about on its first day, which is way more than Clash Royale during its launch, way more than Brawl Stars during its launch, and way more than Boom Beach during its launch. But as you can see in this graph, it collapses so quickly. So quickly it collapses. And we look at this as a running sum, you can really see the cumulative download curve bend inward on day 5. Whereas if you look at Clash Royale or Brawl Stars, there is no such bend. It looks like it's not linear. There is a bend, but it doesn't bend like a twig like Squad Buster does on day 5. So that's your first clue that, hey, something might be weird here. This isn't what we'd normally expect. And so what you end up finding when you look at daily active users, and all of this data is pulled from Sensor Tower, is that there is a huge decline in daily active users in Squad Busters during the first 10 days. There's a rapid decline. And when you benchmark that against Clash Royale and Brawl Stars, they are stacking DAU in their first 10 days. They're actually growing and they start to level off really around day 15. They find an equilibrium, whereas Squad Busters continues to decline and decline and decline. And that is a huge problem, not just that they're declining and not stacking DAU, but if you also just look at the relative values here, Clash Royale and Brawl Stars, by day 30, they're hitting their equilibrium at around 12.5, 15 million DAU. Squad Busters, around 2.5. So huge difference in magnitude and a very different slope between the two games. So the plot's starting to thicken here, right? Very different launch, very different numbers, DAU not stacking, just like troubling signs. And then what you do is you compare it on an absolute basis. So we're just looking at the first 30 days since launch, but let's just look at the Supercell portfolio and judge it relative to where the Super is right now. And this to me is the most damning graph of all. Squad Busters is the lowest engagement game out of Supercell's entire portfolio, behind even Heyday, which is still running, by the way. Heyday has been going on for over a decade. It's impressive, but it's the worst performing game in their portfolio. And it doesn't have any impact. It's just not doing anything. So extremely troubling so far. Another damning graph here is if you just looked at it from a portfolio level. So if we summed up all the games in Supercell's portfolio, all of the DAU together, is the portfolio increasing or decreasing since Squad Busters launch? Because the other thing that could happen is cannibalization, right? Other players from other Supercell games might churn out of those games and go to Squad Busters. So that could be a potential problem here. But when you just look at the portfolio DAU since Squad Busters launch, it's actually on the decline. And there, you might say there could be other factors, right? You just told me, Phil, that Squad Busters is only doing 2 million DAU, whereas let's say Brawl Stars is doing like 60 million DAU. Of course, it wouldn't have a big impact on the portfolio. And yeah, that's the point. It doesn't have an impact on the portfolio. Not a good sign. And so you start to think about, okay, what could be some reasons for this game kind of having this bowed out curve, this quick decline in DAU? There are a lot that we'll get to, but the first thing I want to do is look at it on a regional basis. And when you look at it on a regional basis and you divide it between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, and these are just different collections of country that we usually group by monetization level. So we think about a tier 1 country, Germany, United States. When you think about tier 2, Sweden, Ireland, and tier 3 might be India or the Philippines, just regions that don't have really high monetization values. When you break out the cumulative amount of downloads for Squad Busters and all the other Supercell games between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, that one of the places Squad Busters is struggling in the most is tier 1 and tier 2, and a lot of its downloads actually come from tier 3. So why would a lot of its downloads be coming from tier 3? What's going on here? And so one of the things that was really interesting about Squad Busters was pre-registrations. So this is a new tactic that Google Play has developed and Apple has developed. Or I wouldn't say new, it was around during Brawl Stars, but they're pushing it more and more. So what you can do is you can go in the App Store, you can say pre-register, and then when the game comes out on Google Play, it'll automatically download to your phone. And when you're in the App Store, you get a notification. You still have to go in and download it. And they were pushing these pre-registrations in so many other of Supercell's titles. And not only that, they actually created a really good public goods game almost. So what would happen, if you're playing Clash of Clans, you can go in and you can pre-register for the game in Clash of Clans. And if they hit certain milestones, let's say 5 million pre-registration, then you actually get a reward in Clash of Clans based on the number of pre-registrations for Squad Busters. So a lot of people ended up doing these flimsy pre-registrations. And so what happens is that when you break down those games by region as well, you find that Clash of Clans, Clash Royale, and Brawl Stars all have a very significant portion of their DAU from tier 3 regions. So Clash of Clans, to give you an example, has about 85% of its DAU is from tier 3. And that's the biggest game in its portfolio. So a lot of Clash of Clans users, I would argue, and Clash Royale and Brawl Star players ended up pre-registering and ended up going into Squad Busters. And that explains a lot of their tier 3 DAU share. And that also would go back, and I would explain why so many people churn from the game so quickly, is that they were pre-registration users, they were tier 3, which has lower retention rates to begin with, and they have real opportunity cost, which is the other Supercell games. So they pre-registered, they went into the game, and then they churned. That would be my basic explanation for why Squad Busters had so much fat trimmed very quickly versus the other titles.
And
But
they
I think
pre-registered because that was incentivized.
Yep. They would get kickbacks almost. I think there's another explanation here, which is a lot of brand marketing spend, which I've ridiculed as being inefficient. So they ran this really big campaign where you saw Will Arnett and Chris Helmsworth almost cosplay as Squad Busters players. And to me, there's a question about whether or not this sort of brand marketing is really effective. And not to poke too much at Second Dinner, but they also pulled this stuff for Marvel Snap's launch. If you remember way back when, they had this very expensive Samuel L. Jackson ad where he played Nick Fury. And I heard this was extremely expensive. Like, Samuel L. Jackson is one of the most expensive actors actually of our generation. And to do commercials, they are extremely expensive. I heard, and this is a rumor, that this was $10 million to put together this creative, which is mind-boggling. So are you going to get more than $10 million back in revenue? Is skeptical. But the whole theory of brand marketing is something that to me is antithesis to a lot of economic thinking. When I speak to brand marketers, it feels like the playbook is the same. They want to create this like confluence of events. You want to have all these different things triggering at once, and they want to create noise. And that creates what they call awareness, which is the first part of the funnel. You create awareness, then someone gets more interested in the product, and we can think about all the different funnels that someone would go through. But it starts with awareness. And if you want to create awareness, you need to create noise. And if you want to create noise, you need this confluence of events. You need everything to be strung together. When you think about a movie, it's the best example of this, right? It's all about that first weekend and creating as much buzz as possible and creating this confluence of events. But I think about like an economist, right? It's not clear to me that that when you sum all these parts together, that it's the whole is greater than the sum of their parts. I actually feel like you get a lot of diminishing returns from each of these parts. For instance, I know if I was thinking about how to maximize my marketing spend, I could do a billboard, which is a stupid idea. You could do a billboard and that costs X number of dollars and that gets X number of impressions. And then I could also do like a TV ad. But what can happen is you can like double target a user. So not only do they see the billboard, they also see the TV ad. And I would argue that when you double target a user, the additional revenue you get from that actually decreases. There isn't any like special interaction effect. I think you're just double paying for a user, right? So not only do you have to pay for them to see the billboard ad, you also have to pay for them to see the TV ad. Like a lot of that thinking, I think, actually strikes at the whole theory of brand marketing, that this is just ineffective to start with, that there isn't these interaction effects that make the individual parts sum greater than the individual parts, that there's actually a negative effect here, that you're actually double paying for the same user to see the same ad across multiple platforms. That would be my counter thesis to brand marketing. So I think they may have misspent on a lot of brand marketing. And one of the things that I also looked into, because Supercell has done this brand marketing before, is they ran this infamous 2015 Liam Neeson Super Bowl ad for Clash of Clans. Do you guys remember this?
Yeah,
This was huge. This was huge at the time, and this got so much positive buzz because they got 80 million YouTube views. And they got not only 80 million YouTube views, they also got 120 million views during the Super Bowl, right? And then you look at what the impact was on downloads. It was peanuts. It was peanuts. Their download ranking way back when this aired in 2018 during the the Patriots versus Seahawks Super Bowl, which is fucking great, by the way. It's probably the best Super Bowl of all time, was minimal. The download ranking was very marginal. If you do a lot of back of the envelope math, you think about how many downloads this drove, it's just simply not enough relative to the cost here. So I think there's a lot of reasons to be pretty skeptical on brand. And the other thing that I think was really important thinking about the role of brand was a piece by Eric Seifert, who's a brilliant individual. And one of the things he really challenges is just how brand marketers think of themselves. And he says a CMO, a chief marketing officer, should own the company's outward-facing growth initiatives. A lot of CMOs don't think that way. They think they should own the brand vision or the thoughts that are conjured up when customers think of the product. Really, what marketers should drive instead is actually growth. Like that ultimately is what marketers need to drive growth. They shouldn't be driving brand vision or brand the thoughts that you think of when you think about a product. They should be driving growth. That ultimately is the KPI they're responsible for, not some of this artsy fartsy stuff. When I talk to a lot of brand marketers, the things that they're most proud of are like stunts. I was talking to one brand marketer, and they were doing Jay-Z's biography, and they were telling me about to do Jay-Z's biography. They did this thing where they had a projector, and it would project pages from Jay-Z's biography, and they would project these pages at the locations that the biography was referencing on that page. If Jay-Z was talking about a particular hotel in Los Angeles that was important, they would project the page that his biography talks about that LA hotel on the hotel. But when you like think about that as an economist, like what are the level of impressions for that? Chris, doesn't seem very high. Doesn't seem like there'd be very high number of impressions. So it feels like there's just a lot of stuntiness and not a lot of thinking about what happens down funnel. Is the benefits going to outweigh the cost? So I'd say, look, I think this is a marketing story. It's a tale of pre-registrations that ultimately didn't deliver, that weren't effective. And it's a tale of brand marketing that ultimately is ineffective at being able to acquire high quality users. And that to me right now is the story.
Phil, one of the charts I was really excited about was the per user spend. Like ARPDAU was actually higher for Squad Busters than any other game. And I think it was either last episode or 2 episodes ago where we talked about they're pretty aggressive in round spending. Like you can spend every single round infinitely. You can buy an infinite amount of power up. And I think there's an interesting...
You can't spend infinite.
ARPDAU, almost like limitless. Like every round you could spend money if you really wanted to.
True,
so
but you are capped. So there are the keys you can buy, which let you open chests, and you have to keep buying more keys. But you can't. There's a limit to how many keys that you can use in a given round. So there still is a monetization ceiling
there's still a
per
cap.
round.
Okay, but still much higher cap than like a traditional Brawl Stars or something like that, where there's a limited amount of money you could spend. And honestly, they don't incentivize you to spend money that much in Brawl Stars. They give you tons of free stuff. So that's one thing that I think is a bit bullish. And I almost wonder, Supercell is creating a portfolio of games. Obviously, Brawl Stars, Clash Royale, these are like their kind of bread and butter, where a lot of their users come from, and very retentive games. Like I still play Brawl Stars every once in a while. It's super simple, super easy to jump into. Even if I haven't played it in a while, I can jump in, play a game in 3 minutes. That's for a specific demographic. Is it possible that Squad Busters was supposed to lock into a different type of demo that they might not have? Right? We talked about cannibalization. Does it behoove you to create a Brawl Stars killer as Supercell? Probably not. You don't want to kill off Brawl Stars. You want to access this different group of people. Now, I'm assuming the marketing spend was non-trivial for this, and I don't think that this was like a lower cost product than any of their other products.
50 million is my guess.
Okay. It's not like they were like, oh, let's do a low cost product, low marginal cost, low marginal benefit. But I almost wonder, is there room for a product that could still be successful, that's capturing new players, new people? That's not what's happening here, especially when you look at this pre-registration picture. But it does make you think. A giant company like Supercell with this portfolio of games and products, and I would argue, I don't play Clash Royale. I do play Brawl Stars. I think there's 2 completely different types of games that are potentially targeting different demos. Is that being too nice, or is this possible?
I think a lot of your observations is right. Like the idea that you're going to launch a game that, let's say, that you're going to launch another game and a given player is going to play 2 games at once is a farce. Like the probability of that happening is very low. Like the idea that you're going to stack these LTVs for an individual player is nonsense to me. So you're looking at cannibalization. And so then you're thinking about, okay, what's the LTV of that given player in one game, and what's the LTV of a player in the other game? And I want to funnel them to the revenue maximizing game. Like I want, just like we say, land goes to its highest value use. We want players to go to their highest value game. And first of all, it's not clear that Squad Busters, but the more important point is they didn't even do that. Like they didn't even cannibalize Brawl Stars. There was a small decrease in Brawl Stars. Brawl Stars is DAU during this period, but it's just minuscule. It's absolutely minuscule. Like to your point, Chris, like when your portfolio grows to a certain level, you need to think about exactly what you mentioned. Like, how is this game going to grow the portfolio rather than just rearrange the deck chairs?
Yeah.
And I think that becomes an increasing problem for a lot of different companies. Like, how do I grow the portfolio versus just rearrange deck chairs? And I think this game never had a really strong thesis on the target demo. Like you do, Rob Lowe, who's the marketing executive, came out and said it's Super Smash Brothers in terms of all the IP combination. There's actually a lot of parallels to Mario Kart as well in terms of the rubber banding, it being accessible, and it fits into the kids category, being for kids, just like Brawl Stars is. I was in Rome recently, and it's crazy how many kids I see with Brawl Stars swag. But that to me doesn't grow the portfolio, right? If you're going after the same demo, like you need to go after different types of users. Like Heyday is an economy management game that goes after females. It's very different than Supercell's other portfolio. So I would say it's the same thing for any company that has like so many different planks. It's like at some point, this is how you do imperialism, right? You go after different things rather than just cannibalize your own portfolio.
And it didn't just have a weak marketing thesis. I think it has a weak game design thesis. I don't know what Squad Busters is. I've played a few games. I've tried to get into it. I've heard what Eric has to say about it, and I'm not convinced that this is a game with a clear vision or a clear thesis. It's like when you're a company this size, what was this game for? Who was this game for? To me, it felt like Brawl Stars, but I said this on day one when we first started talking about Squad Busters. I was like, felt like Brawl Stars, but I prefer Brawl Stars over Squad Busters because it's simpler, cleaner. What did you ultimately attribute the poor performance to? Is it just a bad game?
I think I think there's in the debate between, we think about leaky bucket is something marketers like to say. I'm pumping a bunch of users into something and they're churning. I'm pumping users into quicksand. Or was the marketing bad? And it's really hard to do causal inference on both of those. You can't really even do RCTs on that. I would attribute this to not finding first of all, they shouldn't have launched. They didn't go through soft launch. That's the whole point of the article more than anything else, is that you got to go through soft launch to figure out whether or not you should scale this game. Like KPIs in soft launch are predictive of games at global. They are. Like there is some scale effects, but you can use some pretty reasonable models on this. To me right now, I think more than anything, the game's just feature short. The game's feature short. They went heavy on brand marketing, and pre-registrations are full of shit. They shouldn't have done as many pre-registrations as they did. They pushed that way too hard. I don't even know if you want to do pre-registration. Like people want someone from Brawl Stars to go to this game. Exactly what we were talking about earlier. They might have lower LTVs. Like it's not clear to me that's what you want to do. So I think pre-registrations I'm extremely skeptical of pre-registrations, the theory of pre-registrations, and I'm extremely skeptical of how they spent their brand marketing money. Those to me harmed rather than helped Squad Busters. But more than anything, this game just didn't have the features that it needed to have at launch to be able to maintain a strong user base.
Okay, I'd buy that. But it performed abysmally. Like
it's bad.
I'm not convinced of the this. Do you think they could have fixed the problems if they had done soft launch beforehand?
I think you just need more time to add more features. There's no social.
More features?
There's no social. PvP is just lackluster. It almost is non-existent. It's a very flimsy leaderboard. They need time to get the level 4 evolutions in, which would have increased spend cap quite a bit. The live ops playbook it's really basic right now. Like I play this game religiously, and to me the live ops are like sometimes they have this card thing, and sometimes like I get out of a round and it says I can flip a card and I get a couple of resources. Then I can flip another card. That is their live ops right now. That's it. It's all they have. This game needed more time to really hone its identity and just deliver on the basics. Like one of the other things that was really interesting to look into is like for the first 7 days of this game's launch, the ratings on the App Store were abysmal. So the average rating was around like a 3.5 in the United States, which is really poor. Usually you need 4 or above to get featuring on the App Store. And this was really low. And I was like, oh my God, what's happening? Why is this so low? Usually it's a technical problem. Usually what happens is that you didn't whitelist the right devices. So people who are like in India who tend to have lower processing power will download the game and then it runs really poorly and they leave it a 1-star review. But it turns out the problem with this game is that they didn't do review prompting. So review prompting is when you get a message in game that says, hey, if you like this game, you should leave a review on the App Store. And they only implemented that, I think it was 15 days after launch. And you can very clearly see the change from having really poor 1-star reviews to having a ton of 5-star reviews. Not only does that share change, but the N increases. So they go from having 250 reviews a day to having 2,000 to 5,000 a day when they do review prompting. That to me is just a sign that this thing was not ready to go.
Interesting. Because the people who aren't being prompted are typically dissatisfied.
Yes.
Disproportionately satisfied.
They self-select into bitching.
Yeah, exactly.
It's review bombing on Steam almost.
It's interesting.
All right, let's talk about our first paper in our new section. The paper is called One Cohort at a Time, a New Perspective on the Declining Gender Pay Gap. This was a fucking great paper, in my opinion, for so many different reasons. One, it was only 29 pages, which is pretty unusual for econ papers these days. Usually they're about like 80 pages long. This is pretty reasonable. Not only that, this had a real result that was applicable not only to policymakers, but I think also to NGOs and to a wide variety of people. And I thought the analysis was rather convincing as well. And so what is this paper actually about? So the paper tries to explain the gender pay gap between men and women, the differences in wages between both of them, not necessarily as a result of any discrimination, but instead the theory that they offer is that there's actually this effect where a lot of older men are not leaving the workforce at the rates they once did. And so it's creating a bottleneck in wages. So a lot of younger men are getting to the point where they should be going to higher level careers that pay more. And instead, they're not able to move to those careers because they're preoccupied by men who are older. And so what that means is that they're in lower paying jobs than they might otherwise be in. And so that is actually what's closing the gap. It's that a lot of these men are actually getting paid lower than they would previously. And that's actually converging with where women are. And we'll now start to go into some of the evidence for this.
I just made a
Hold on,
connection with the Biden situation. Old man doesn't want to leave office.
What is it? The genocracy? What's the word again?
Geriantocracy?
Geriatalk, yeah. Ruled by boomers.
The paper uses data from the USA and from Italy, which is pretty interesting. The first graph that we're looking at here is just the gender gap in weekly earnings for both the United States and Italy as a time series. And it starts at 1976 and it goes to 2020. And against all good reason and judgment, they made this a dual axis graph, which drives me fucking insane because there's so many tricks you can play with dual axis. But by and large, the trend is pretty similar. You can see as a time series, the gender pay gap is radically declining, almost linearly in both the USA and Italy, although at different levels from 1976 to 2020.
Notice the gender gap is smaller in Italy, which is a country that prioritizes leisure time over the United States. And one of the big contributors to the gender pay gap in the United States has to do with leisure and outside of work hours. We're going to see later that the pay gap starts to expand, it becomes larger as you grow older within a cohort. And that's largely due to women leaving the workforce altogether.
That's true. I think the other thing that's important to note here when you look at the dual axis, God damn, I want to strangle someone. But when you look at the log weekly earnings for USA workers on the gender pay gap, it starts at 0.8 and it goes down to 0.3 in terms of the gap. So there was a much more radical decline in the United States that on an absolute basis than in Italy.
Wait, Chris, can you talk more about that leisure time thing? So you're saying in Italy, there's more leisure time, which means that women have fewer time pressures and therefore are more capable to work the jobs?
So that's part of it. So there's a labor supply story where the protections for women leaving the workforce are better in Europe largely than they are in the United States. So you get more paid time off. You can leave the workforce for, I think in some countries up to 2 years, like Scandinavia, you can leave the workforce for 2 years still, right? And still be on your salary job or whatever. So there's a lot better kind of benefits for leaving the workforce. So that is one of the big contributors. The other thing is just that's disproportionately impacting women. And then you have like uniformly across both genders, you just have this more interest in leisure time, more time spent on leisure in European countries than you have in the United States. So that's what's also going to just shift there's a lower top end of the distribution, which shrinks the gap, if that makes sense.
Because a lot of the gap is in the high income earners, which this paper also supports.
Yeah. Sorry. Just an interesting little point.
And I think this next figure that we're looking at right now is the gender pay gap between and within cohorts. So what this is showing is that linear decline in the gender pay gap in the United States and in Italy. But what this also layers in is looking at the gender pay gap for people by birth year. And what it'll do is it'll separate out different generations into those cohorts. So we can say for people born between, let's say, 1952 and 1956, how is the gender pay gap for people born in that era changing over time, and different effects in both the United States and in Italy. And what you'll see is that over time, the gender pay gap for the United States as each of those cohorts is aging starts to decline. There's almost this like complete flattening, or at least this kind of flattening where the gender pay gap stops increasing as workers get older and older around the year 2000 for almost all of the cohorts, which I thought was really interesting. There's some socioeconomic effects that appear to be happening in the United States. Whereas when you look at Italy, within each of the cohorts, as the cohorts are getting older and older, the gender pay gap is increasing in each of them. Although over time, that relative increase is shifting downward. So it's still the case that as the cohorts are getting older, the gender pay gap is increasing, but the absolute level of that gender pay gap has been shifting down between each of the cohorts.
I'm honestly surprised they didn't see more dramatic differences, though I would argue that they do see dramatic differences. But
Between
It's
Italy and
interest-
US or between
between Italy and US, what's interesting and notable about the Italy graph is you'll notice within each cohort, the gap continues to increase forever. And in the US, it increases and then it starts to steady off. And then sometimes it even goes down, like in the case of the 1947 cohort. I would assume that this is due to the fact that in Italy, as a woman, once you have a child, you're much less likely to ever enter back into the workforce. They're also probably more, what's the word I'm looking for? Single income households in Italy versus the US. So that's probably attributing
Survival bias.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
They're also starting
Go
just from a way higher point in the US, literally double the pay gap in the US compared to Italy.
I still think this flattening in the United States is very interesting. Around 96 to 2000, that the gender pay gap within each cohort, it's not increasing like it is in Italy. It's flattening out against all cohorts, which suggests to me that there was some sort of socioeconomic policy happening around then that kind of helped push this along.
Interesting. I don't know if I would look at these two graphs and say that there's a definitive difference between the slope in the top and the bottom. Yeah, the US is flattening out, but so too is Italy. Italy has potentially, based on all of our previous comments about the US having so much more room to go, maybe you would expect it to be reversed. The US gap is more quickly declining than Italy. Or no, actually, it makes more sense because Italy is more like binary, more single family homes. There's more kind of room to grow or not grow for the gender pay gap. I don't know. As you normalize women entering the workforce in Italy versus the United States, has been pretty normal for the last 40 years.
So if we go to this next figure 4, and this to me is the paper coming together. It is looking at the pay positions in the positions in pay distribution for 25-year-olds, the mean man at age 25 and the mean woman at age 25. And it's doing it as a time series. So what we're doing is we're looking at, okay, for the mean man at age 25 in 1976, where were they in terms of the percentile of wage distribution? And for the mean man, let's say at age 25 in 2020, where are they in terms of wage distribution in that given year? So if you're starting in 1976, the mean man at age 25 was at the 50th percentile of wages. So 50% of people earned more than that mean man at age 25, and 50% people earned less than that mean man at age 25. Whereas for women in 1976, they were at the 31st percentile. So there was 70% of people earned more than women at age 25, and 30% earned less than women at age 25. And what you can see is that for the mean man at age 25, their pay percentile is decreasing over time. So 1976, you're starting at 50th, and by 2020, you hit the 38th percentile. Whereas for women, it is largely stable, at least in the United States. Whereas when we turn to Italy, we just see linear declines for men. It starts at 47 and ends up at 33. There's a lot less noise in there. Whereas for women, it starts at 33 and goes to 27. So not as quite a steep slope as men.
And
This
Italy
to me
is
is
a
the slam
stronger
dunk
downward
paper.
trend because they got more old people.
Yes. There would be more people who are refusing to leave the workforce, more older men in high-paying positions in Italy that are refusing to leave the workforce. That would explain the relatively larger decline in male earnings at age 25.
Discuss the very basics of the model with respect to the old versus young and top versus bottom. Did we talk about that?
No,
And do
should
we want to talk about that?
Yeah, please.
I think it's so the mechanic here, why we look at the top graph and we see let's just assume this is a beautiful graph, and I'm not as convinced of this graph actually, but let's assume that we see the mean man at age 25 in the US go from the 50th percentile down to the 25th percentile. So they drop a 25 percentile point. And then you have the mean woman stays exactly the same at I guess that's not 25, whatever that number is a little blurry. What's happening here supposedly is that there are disproportionately more men in high paying positions than there are women. And there's also a higher cost of employing a woman for the firm than there is of employing a man. So what this ends up doing is it creates a dynamic where as men are sticking around in higher paying positions, that doesn't impact women because women were never in those higher paying positions anyway. So they're being like they're not being impacted by this old man sticking around because they were never impacted to begin with. However, the men are because they were in those positions. So in early times, men were rising up into these high paying positions. So it's actually very similar to the black white wage gap literature, which is basically just it is this, and this is my area of expertise, so that's why I'm referring to it. But it's basically like a lot of the black white wage gap is statistical. The fact that white people hold more prestigious, more high paying positions than black people. It's not necessarily that within a single firm, a black person is being paid less than a white person. There's not necessarily this within firm discrimination that's happening. So it's similar with this paper. And what I like about this paper is most gender pay gap literature is our statistical approaches, because it's obvious that women and men and blacks and whites are completely equivalent, right, in terms of their skill distributions. But there's a statistical component where, for one reason or another, people end up getting different jobs. So this takes a statistical approach, and it says, because there were already fewer women in high paying positions to begin with, they weren't impacted by this aging top tier male cohort. But the top tier young males are being impacted. So their wages are decreasing, women are staying the same. So I like it because it's a statistical approach to a question. You also have the classic approach. The classic model is also statistical, and it says, as an employer, I know that this woman is probably going to end up having to take maternity leave. She might never come back. Maybe she, has a child. And that's why we saw the gender pay gap increasing throughout the lifetime of a cohort. So I statistically discriminate against women, and I hire a male for this prestigious position because I know he's not going to go anywhere, or at least I think he has a lower probability of going somewhere than somebody else. So that's like the very basics of the model. The aging male population in high paying jobs is disproportionately impacting young males compared to young females. That's the model.
And to me, the graph that really drove this home was looking at the workforce aging in the United States. So if you look at the mean age in the US population, so we're not looking at the workforce on the first graph, but if you look at just the US population, the mean age of the US population has been increasing. So it used to be about 32 and a half. And right now the mean age is actually 38.5, which is just a function of the baby boom. You just have this older cohort, which is just moving through the population, increasing this. So this is going to tip and go down after the baby boomers are gone. And then when you look at panel B, which is the mean age of US private employees, you basically see the same effect, that the mean age of US employees has been increasing. So it started in 1976 at around 37.5 years of age. And now it's actually 41.5 years of age, which is fucking crazy, by the way. When you think about the mean age of a US employee is 41 and a half years old, is wild to me. But this to me is just like the base level of evidence. I think we also need to get this thing off the ground. And I think they did a good job of presenting it. And to me, it's pretty clear. Now they go on, they build a model, of course, and they go on to argue that like this kind of bottlenecking of male wages, it explains all of the gender pay gap. And I don't know if I'm on that boat yet, but to me, this is a pretty novel approach. And the thing that shocked me is just how flat women's wages were over this period. I really expect to see more growth in women's wages, and I'm surprised we haven't seen it to the degree we did in this paper. Don't get me wrong, the gender pay gap is increasing, but I expected like the percentile of women's wages to be much higher than they are.
This is percentile of the mean woman at age 25.
Yeah, that is true.
The mean female wage has increased during this time period.
Yep.
So if you're looking at this and you're not like an econ PhD or something like that, like this isn't saying that people are getting paid less. This is just saying like percentile, but
everyone's getting paid more. Yeah, that is important.
I want to piggyback off of what you said, Phil, with respect to this does not explain the entire diminishing of the gender pay gap, because this is an interesting mechanism that probably explains some of it, but I don't want to throw shade because I haven't dug into the paper super, super deeply, but oftentimes you'll see a trend and it could be backed up by multiple theories. So they make a lot of really cool plots that back up what they say. But, and this is why I'm curious where this paper will end up. Right now, this is a working paper. So this is just like available for free on the internet. They wrote it. They haven't published it yet. So this is a pre-publication paper. And I'm curious where it's going to end up because they don't actually have any quasi-experimental structure. So they talk about counterfactuals at one point in the paper, but beyond just doing like large cohort counterfactuals, in order to really be successful in this literature, and this is probably the biggest problem with the entire labor economic literature, especially personnel economics, and personnel economics talks about pay gaps, black-white wage gap, gender pay gap, these types of things. The problem with this entire field is in order to do a true counterfactual, you need to compare two people within firm. And you can't do that in this literature. What you can do, especially with these surveys, they use the CPS, ACS, American Community Service, current population survey, and then I don't think they use the NLSY, but they use like some of these big giant surveys with tens of thousands of individuals and observation, which is great. And there's lots of industry and occupation details, how much do you make, even opinion questions. But the problem with them is you cannot compare two people in the same organization. So if you want to study like statistical versus taste-based discrimination in like the black-white wage gap, you would literally need to follow Joe and Bob. Joe is white, Bob is black, when they're in the same firm and see if there's any differential. So it's not too dissimilar with this paper is really cool. It has some excellent visuals that really compel the theory, but you can write a theory to fit any visualization that you find. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that you're like, it doesn't mean that you're right. The only way that this paper is going to become a big hit is if it can convince the typical academic in economics that the theory is very sound and also general, because the statement that much of the diminishing in the pay gap can be attributed to this aging of the male top labor force, it's a cool theory, and there's some graphs that can back it up, but there's no counterfactual that you can actually run to study this. It's very difficult to set up an experimental structure. That's not to say this isn't going to be an impactful paper. I think 20 years ago, I talked about Bjork 2007 earlier. I think it's David Bjork 2007. He wrote like a very similar type of paper. He had a theoretical model, and then he had a bunch of really awesome visualizations to back the theoretical model up. Now, that was 20 years ago almost. Totally different environment. It was I don't want to say it was much easier, but it was much easier to publish those types of papers where you have a theory, you show some cross tabulations and some cohort analysis that backs up your theory. Much easier to publish that back in the early 2000s, late 1990s. These days, I'm not so sure. The types of papers that are coming out are so heavily theoretical, so heavily structural, and so heavily, unless you were running an experiment in a small village in like the Congo, like you're not gonna publish something like this. I don't think this is gonna get super great publication.
They don't have an identification strategy because there's no quasi-experimental method. There's no
descriptive
synthetic
paper.
control. There's no diff and diff. There's nothing here. But
Paper, yeah.
we should talk more about this because there was another really interesting paper that kind of looked about how science is actually done. And we always say RCTs, randomized controlled trials, are the gold standard. And I bought into that. But this paper tried to argue that a lot of scientific knowledge actually doesn't come through RCTs. It comes in a variety of ways. And there's still something to causal inference like this. There's still something to that I think can advance the cause. But I would agree, you're totally right. Like in modern academia, like no identification strategy, no RCT. You don't have US-based data. These things, it makes it really hard to get your argument across the line, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse.
No, I think that's where I was headed with this. I think like it is a valuable paper. It's an extremely valuable, just the visualizations that they put together with the various different, I don't typically see Italian data in labor economics papers. Scandinavian data is very common. I think they did Luxembourg as well. So two pretty unique
The wage
labor
data in
economies.
Scandinavia. Like this is the one thing people don't realize is like, you can just, in Sweden, you can go on, you can request anyone's tax returns and you can get them. Like you can go on and Google right now and you can get my tax returns.
You see, there's no gap, wage gap, in Scandinavia.
Oh, I highly doubt that's the case.
I thought that's what you said.
No, that actually isn't the case. There's actually a paper that identifies that like there actually is a pretty significant wage gap in Scandinavia. But again, it's not controlling for profession choice. But you can get really good wage data, which is why you see so many Swedish papers come out. It's very easy. And Finland, all the Scandinavian countries that have high levels of trust, there's almost no privacy here, which would drive Americans crazy. Like you can but you can do it.
Wait, but didn't you say you do a bunch of funky tax stuff with your income? So that like, doesn't that mean
Well,
like
for
the
the
publicly
Americans.
available tax return is going to be like fudged because everyone's doing funky tax stuff?
No, not in that sense. It depends on how income is counted. So like when you request someone's tax return, you don't get like these crazy, you don't, if you work 2 jobs, that's not going to be reflected in the public tax return that you request. You're just going to see a wage rate and it's going to merge both of those things together. So there's stuff like that you're not going to get breakdowns on. It's what you fill in the tax form, which is a lot of stuff ends up getting merged. It isn't broken out. Like your dividends, like things like dividends get broken out. But like we could talk about Scandinavian tax strategy. There's a lot we could go into in that. But by and large, it's what's reported to Skatteverket, which is the tax agency here. This is why there was a great lottery paper for Swedish lottery winners recently that we should talk about at some point.
I guess one
Sorry, go ahead.
big takeaway I had from this paper was just like looking at the cohorts and looking at the start and the end of each cohort is really important, right? If you just lump the gender wage gap in aggregate, one trend, but if you look at within a group, a different trend, and a lot of the pattern is explained by these population humps moving through the different age brackets.
That's the takeaway
look at your
games.
cohorts.
Like look at your core. We're just looking at ARPDAO and Squad Busters. ARPDAO looked really high, but it's only because they assassinated half their users.
Exactly, yeah. That's all I had.
You said something early, actually at the beginning before we started recording, Eric. Oh, I'm surprised that even today there are still papers that are coming out that are using the ACS and the CPS and doing basically like crosstabs, cohort analysis. Like this type of stuff it just goes to show that there's still so much out there that we haven't even looked at with respect to these surveys. And when I was finishing up my PhD 4 years ago now, I had this discussion. It was like, oh, there's not much you can do with the ACS. So I wouldn't spend too much time with that. It's actually maybe probably not true. So I think that's an interesting point. There's still so much growth to be had and so much to discover from these data sets that have been absolutely researched the hell out of.
That's a wrap. Send us a text message if you liked our new format. We're going to do game papers too. We're going to do Steve Levitt's Candy Crush paper. There's another one from a friend of the cast, Julian Rouge, published. We're going to be going through that one. And if you have recommendations, please send us our way. We're probably going to do a little bit more Nobel Prize winning papers. Let's talk about that. And we'll be tying it more into games too. I think there's a lot you can get out of this if you're an analyst or you're a product manager as well. All right, cool. Game Economist cast. In the can.
Nice. Bye, guys.
See y'all.
We should teach this to our children. Economics is major.